Welcome to the Zoom a Scientist series. This series is sponsored by Lake Champlain Sea Grant, UVM Extension, and SUNY Plattsburgh's education program known as Watershed Alliance. Lake Champlain Sea Grant develops and shares science-based knowledge to benefit the environment and economies of the Lake Champlain Basin. Watershed Alliance aims to reach K-12 students and their teachers throughout the basin. Our goal is to increase awareness and knowledge of watershed issues in youth throughout Vermont and New York. The Zoom a Scientist series was created in response to the current need for more virtual programming. Today's presenter is Will Eldridge, an aquatic habitat biologist from the Vermont Department of Fish and Wildlife. Will grew up exploring streams near Washington, D.C., and received a PhD in fishery sciences from the University of Washington and a Master of Science in fishery sciences from the University of Minnesota. Prior to moving to Vermont, he worked at the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission in Olympia, Washington, where he teamed up with state, federal, and Native American biologists and hatchery managers to address impacts of fish culture on Endangered Species Act listed Pacific salmon. At the Stroud Water Research Center near Philadelphia, he conducted field and laboratory studies to understand impacts of thermal effluent and land use changes on temperate and tropical freshwater and diadromous fish species. At the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, as the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department aquatic habitat biologist, Will works with state, federal, and local partners to protect, restore, and enhance habitat for fish and wildlife in and around streams, rivers, lakes, and wetlands throughout Vermont. He primarily focuses on restoring aquatic organism passage at culverts and dams and protecting and restoring forested riparian areas. He also works on in-stream, floodplain, and wetland habitat. Will's tool chest includes monitoring and assessment, technical and financial assistance, grant administration, education and outreach, and project coordination and implementation. He and his wife have 2 young boys, and in their spare time, they hike, ski, and read books together. Will be giving a talk titled Brook Trout Grow on Trees today. Wild brook trout are doing very well in Vermont. A recent statewide assessment found that the abundance of brook trout in streams and rivers across the state is the same now as it had been in the 50s and 60s. This assessment did not evaluate the cause for this success, but it would be reasonable to attribute a large portion of it to the health of streamside forests throughout the state. And with that, Will, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks again for joining us and looking forward to your presentation today.
All right, thank you. Yeah, thanks, Nate. Cool, so I'm gonna grab the screen here. Hopefully this works. All right, can you all see, it should be a PowerPoint, Fish Grow on Trees.
Looks good.
Great, cool, yeah, thanks. Yeah, so I'm actually, the title's a little different. Fish Grow on Trees, communicating the importance of forested riparian areas for brook trout. But yeah, you can summarize it as Brook Trout Grow on Trees. Yeah, I mean, it's a catchy title. Hopefully it works, it sticks with you guys. And that's the idea is, to have something that it gets people to ask, gets people thinking. And so I'm going to be talking mostly about trees and riparian areas, the areas next to streams and rivers. But I do want to, at the beginning of this talk, at least, emphasize that brook trout habitat isn't just trees. It includes, the full aspect, ability to move upstream and downstream. So aquatic organism passage is a really important component of the habitat, as well as in-stream structure, that complexity, the idea that rivers are messy, and that most messy rivers are good for brook trout. But to begin with, I'd like to actually start by introducing the brook trout and all the trout in Vermont. Let me see if I can. So there are 3 species of stream trout in Vermont. Resident trout in Vermont. There's the brook trout, which can be identified by its light spots on a dark background. There's also brown trout, which were introduced over 100 years ago and now have established self-sustaining wild populations. And those can be identified by dark spots on a light background. And you also find rainbow trout in some of our streams and rivers, and those generally have darker black spots. And if you look, we did a survey of angler opinion of fish species, preferential fish species in Vermont last year in 2020. And brook trout came out as the most preferred species by resident anglers. So this is a very important species, both from from an angling perspective, so from a fishing perspective, but also from a natural community perspective. Brook trout are found throughout the state, and they are the official state fish. So it's one that's really identifies with Vermont, and it is our native stream salmonid. And so what does brook trout look like? So brook trout are really cool. They can take a variety of kind of morphologies and sizes and shapes. So all these are different pictures. These different pictures are different types of what brook trout can look like. They can be big fish up to 10 pounds or more. I think we don't see too many of those in Vermont, but generally those are associated with lakes. And so this species can inhabit lakes. But generally what we see in our streams and rivers are be more something like you'd see on the pictures on the right there. Those ones that fit in one hand, or you can make them fit them in two hands if you have to. But 5 to 6 inches is kind of a big brook trout in some of our streams and rivers. And these are actually adult individuals, so they are capable of reproducing. So a very dynamic plastic fish, in the sense that it can take on a variety of different morphologies and growth rates and all kinds of things, diets. It's a really cool species. And when we talk about brook trout habitat, there's what I call the 4 C's. So cold. This is a species that really likes cold water. Temperatures, summertime temperatures get above 70 degrees, and brook trout, we don't find brook trout very often in those streams. Clean rivers. So from a water quality perspective, as well as from a sediment, we find that brook trout spawn in the gravel in the substrate and streams, and so having clean gravel is important for those eggs and embryos to survive and to grow. Like I mentioned before, complex. So this idea of in-stream structure. These rivers are messy. Like that's actually really good for brook trout. They'll occupy kind of like backwater, slow water habitat next to an area with where you have like a faster water, and they'll actually just eat fish, they'll eat bugs and whatnot that's drifting through the river. And so they really like those complex habitats. Also helps protect them from predators. Connected is another important point. So a lot of our infrastructure, culverts and things, those can actually block passage to these colder tributary streams. And so making sure that our bridges and culverts provide connectivity is very important for the species, being able to access those spawning and rearing habitats, cold water habitats generally found in the headwaters. All right, and looking at brook trout, their range in the eastern U.S. So like I said, this is a native brook trout to the eastern United States. Native trout species. It's found from as far south as Georgia, up into Maine and on into Canada. And so, it's got a pretty wide range. It's generally found in the higher elevations, so mountainous, in the mountain regions, these headwater streams, a little steeper gradient, which basically describes Vermont. But when we look at the status of brook trout throughout its range, the red here, this is, the red indicates areas where the brook trout's reduced or maybe not even present anymore, maybe extirpated. And you can see and throughout most of its range in the south, it's actually not doing really well. So brook trout is, down there, they're barely hanging on, honestly. Vermont, we're kind of in this transition zone. So a lot of our populations are doing well. They're holding on, but there's definitely areas where we're seeing reductions in their population. So despite what the blurb said, like the data shows that our brook trout are holding on, but they're definitely in this, it doesn't mean that we're out. We can stop worrying about brook trout habitat. We definitely have to keep our eye, something that's important to keep working on, protecting and restoring brook trout habitat. And I hope that's something that comes across in this map. but but like I said, when we did look at this this long-term study from the 1950s through the 2000s, comparing our brook trout, the maps show the distribution of brook trout in the state. Like I said, they can be found almost everywhere, and that was the case in the 1950s. There was a case again in the 2000s. So the distribution of brook trout hasn't really changed over the last 60 years. Similarly, when we look at abundance, at the select sites, the sites where we had data that we could compare those two time periods, we see that the abundance hasn't changed. If anything, it's actually gone up. And we've seen increase in the abundance of what we call YOY, which stands for young of the year. That's basically the baby, the juveniles, the baby brook trout. We're seeing more juvenile production. We don't exactly know why that is. It's definitely an encouraging sign, but the point is that at least at these sites, the 150 sites that we had data, brook trout are doing well. This and the importance here, referring to that map that I showed before. So throughout most of their range, brook trout aren't doing well. Vermont is sort of a stronghold, and I think the point is we want to keep it a stronghold. We want to keep these brook trout healthy going forward. An important way to do that is by protecting and restoring riparian areas. And so what are the threats that brook trout are facing? So first one would be temperature increase. I mentioned before, brook trout like cold water. Temperature increase is one of the biggest threats that they're facing. Rising temperatures. And so here's some examples of, what loss of riparian areas can increase solar radiation and cause streams to warm up. There's another example. This is the graph is showing data from a dam. And so the blue line is upstream of the dam. We see colder water. Downstream of the dam, we see warmer water. And so this one dam is about a 2-acre dam in a headwater stream. We see almost a 13-degree Fahrenheit increase in the temperature of that of the water. And so basically that one small dam is causing a loss of brook trout habitat. So upstream blue line is good habitat, downstream wouldn't be good habitat. And the key temperature we're finding is at 68 degrees Fahrenheit is when we begin to lose brook trout. That's sort of their critical temperature. Another big threat is sediment. And this can come from a variety of sources, bank erosion or overland flow. And like I mentioned before, brook trout spawn in streams and rivers, and they rely on clean gravel for spawning. Sediment can also get in their gills and irritate their gills when it's suspended. And so here are some pictures of what good sediment, or what sediment looks like. So this rock is what we call embedded. So the clear, like the top algae covered area, that would be the stuff that's exposed. The red below that's how embedded that rock is. So that's all covered with sediment. So that would be an indication of a poor stream. Again, sediment can impact other species besides brook trout. So here's a stonefly, which is something that brook trout eat. So not only does it impact the fish, it also can impact their food. And then the juveniles as well. There's also, as I'm sure you all are aware, there's water quality issues associated with sediment. Phosphorus and nitrogen can be associated with it, and so huge water quality issues tied to sediment as well. Another big threat that we've seen is physical habitat alteration. These are pictures of post-Irene, restoration, if you will. But what's happened is that complexity, that messiness that is good for brook trout has been taken out of the stream. So either through mining and just removing the gravel, removing the wood that kind of creates that complexity. These are kind of things that reduce brook trout habitat, reduce their abundance. And so the importance of forested riparian areas. Why are trees important for brook trout? Well, trout grow on trees. Isn't that obvious? In case it's not, so here's the connection. The fish eat the insects, which eat the leaves that come from the trees. So you can actually draw a straight linear connection between brook trout and trees. And this isn't something I came up with. I borrowed this from the Stroudwater Research Center. out of Philadelphia. And that's a place I used to work down there, so I have permission to use it. And it's actually something they encourage everybody to use. But the idea is, it's just a catchy phrase, and it's something that it's sticky, it works. And it's relatively easy to explain. And there is a program that they've developed. It's a curriculum aimed at I think it's grade levels 4 through 12. And I'm going to borrow some of their materials here to kind of emphasize this point of like why riparian areas are important for trout. So anyway, they've developed this curriculum. It's supposed to go in they intended it to be associated with the Trout in the Classroom program that a lot of Trout Unlimited groups use. It can be a standalone program. I think it doesn't. You don't need the trout necessarily. A lot of these concepts are kind of universal. It's handy, but the trout grow on trees. It's a nice concept to have the fish. But anyway, I'll just show you what some of what it includes. To me, one of the nice things, it's got this bucket of benefits. So you actually get a visual of the different benefits that riparian areas provide. And so the idea is you have this bucket and you can pull out all these different things, and each of these things corresponds to a different function or different benefit that riparian areas provide. And I'm just going to walk through a couple of them and explain, why, give the data that actually supports why those are important. And so here's the first one. So you can pull out an ice cube tray, and if you have students, you could ask them, okay, what do you think this ice cube tray represents in terms of a benefit that a riparian area would provide? And the obvious answer would be shading. Maybe not obvious, but anyway, that shading and cooling, things like that. And so when you look at when you look at the data, you actually do see the benefits of the shading, the difference in temperature between shaded and unshaded areas. There's also there's summertime benefits. We also see benefits in the wintertime, where that canopy can actually insulate the streams and prevent the massive larger temperature fluctuations in the winter, which can also be detrimental to fish. That's something that people don't often think about is the winter environment. But winter can be just as stressful, if not more so, than summer. And here's another benefit, is obviously the fish hotel, right? What does that mean? And so this is that you get the idea of getting at that complexity, that messiness, the idea that trees, when they fall in the stream, provide fish habitat. You may have heard of it referred to as large woody debris, or strategic wood addition if it's intentionally placed. I'm encouraging people to use the term fish hotel, because I think debris may have a negative connotation for a lot of people, but thinking of these large wood jams as fish hotels. And so here's an example of a fish hotel. You ask any angler where are they going to find the fish, it's going to be in the wood jam. They're generally deeper, there's cover and as well as food and all that sort of stuff. And there's a study that one of our biologists, Judd Kratzer out of the Northeast Kingdom, did. He's been doing these strategic wood additions, fish hotel additions, over the last number of years, and he's documented 150% increase in trout biomass in these wood addition projects. In the sites where he's added wood, just showing how these sites can benefit or increase trout biomass. Here's some other benefits. A slice of pizza. I don't know if you carry that in a bucket, but if you do, it's something you can pull out, or a fly swatter. And this, obviously, it would be the food aspect. And so, we see that the trees provide leaves, and a lot of the macroinvertebrates, a lot of the bugs that live in streams, eat those leaves. The shredder community. And then there's also what's called allochthonous rain. For those of you using those kind of terms. But that idea is like actual bugs and whatnot that fall off of the trees, an ant, for example. And there is some data showing, I don't think I have a figure for it, but there's some data showing that in streams that with low production, with low in-stream production, that that there's what's called a terrestrial subsidy. So actually, these bugs falling into the river can increase the can support trout production. And so what I'm saying is that there's some streams that are just naturally less productive. They just don't have that kind of base of their food web to provide a lot of the bugs that are born in the stream. And sometimes having bugs that fall in can actually can increase that trout biomass. And then here's another bucket of another benefit. You can either have a sponge or a roll of toilet paper. It's always good to pull out a roll of toilet paper with a school group, ask them what they think that benefit is. And cleaning the water before it gets into the stream, obviously. That's the benefit, another benefit that trees provide. And so there's a lot of data to support this. And so these two figures are taken from a summary report written by a couple of biologists at the Stroudwater Research Center back in 2014. They summarized or took data from a number of other studies and did a summary of all those studies and kind of they compared the buffer width, so how wide that riparian area was. And first they looked at how much nitrate it was able to remove. And they saw that as the buffer width increased, it was able to remove more of the nitrate. Similarly with sediment, the wider the buffer, the more sediment it could store. And so, so what does this mean? Like, what if you're going to go out and implement, a buffer restoration practice or protection, what are the recommendations? And I would point to the Agency of Natural Resources. We have these riparian management guidelines for our state lands, our A&R lands. To me, these present really the desired conditions, what we'd like to see in our forested riparian areas around the state. I realize we're not going to be able to achieve these everywhere, but this is the desired conditions. This is what would be good to reach for brook trout, and as well as the other water quality benefits. And so the big one here is what we call it the riparian management zone. I don't want to read all these, but the idea is that basically it should look like a forest. It should have it should be consistent of native vegetation. It should be continuous, diverse. It should have variety of ages and size structures. Natural duff layer, and then by having that, and it should be, about 100 feet wide is the ideal width. That's the big one. Getting to that 100 feet, I understand isn't going to be possible everywhere. Again, these are the desired conditions. This is what we think would be appropriate everywhere. All right, and that's it. That's all I've got for a presentation. Hopefully you guys have an understanding now of why trout grow on trees and the importance of, trees for protecting and restoring forested riparian areas.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Will. I thoroughly enjoyed that. I really appreciated it. It's a good presentation, really informative, and I like the bucket of benefits. It's good. I had a couple good chuckles in there for sure. So
yeah, I haven't seen it. I've seen like the wetlands side of things where you got your sponge and your oatmeal and things like that, but I have never seen it for the riparian buffer zone. So I'll have to bring that one into the mix too with the bag of tricks.
So for all of our attendees, I'm seeing some questions come through now. Please go ahead and navigate down to the Q&A box and put your questions in there. Oh, they're coming in. Well, you're going to have a lot of questions to answer. So I'll just jump right in and read the first one for you. So this is from Nancy, who is wondering, buffer width is recommended for 100 feet. Just to clarify, that is 100 feet of each side of the stream or river. That's a good clarification.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. Yeah. Good point.
Yeah, absolutely. 100 feet each side. It's you want those buffers on both sides, right? That's great. And then another question from Kimberly. Are brook trout stocked? Are there issues around maintaining natural genetic diversity?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, they are stocked. We've shifted to what's called a triploid, triploids individuals with our stocking program, with the idea that those are actually sterile, and so that we can reduce that risk of genetic hybridization or introgression or with wild populations. So yeah, no, that's a good question.
Gotcha. So is the idea behind that effort then mostly for anglers then, just kind of to maintain, since they're not, you're not trying to bolster like the natural population then if you're introducing sterile individuals? That's a question, a clarification of my own, or like what kind of the impetus is?
Yeah, no, most of our stocking, most of our trout stocking is aimed at the harvest. I don't think we have any brook trout stocking. I'm not aware of any brook trout stocking aimed at like a conservation goal.
Great. Yeah,
Yeah.
thanks. So we have Todd was letting me know there's a question in the chat box. That's great.
Yeah, I can take that one. I've got the chat box open if you want me to. So we've got a question from William in the chat box saying, were the 50s and 60s bellwether years for brook trout? And if so, what was particular about those decades that caused this, or was it simply first data collected?
Yeah, it was honestly, it was the first data collected. That's as far back as our statewide data goes. And I've done a little bit of analysis just looking at land cover from the 50s and 60s, and just based on reports. I mean, we don't have a lot of data from back then, but it looks like at least this percentage of like a watershed area, like we haven't seen a whole lot of change. And I mean, I just looked at the White River, and I think it's 80% forested now, and it's about 80% forested back then. So yeah.
Great. Thanks. We have another question asking, how many streams in Vermont have active projects to increase wood in them? So I'm going to ask you that. I'm going to ask you that a couple of ways. The number of streams is going to be tough, I would imagine. And if you have that number on the top of your head, I'll be impressed. But I'm wondering like whether there are projects, planting projects that are trying to do that on a long-term basis, or direct, I'm thinking of like, Christmas trees and like introducing woody debris in some stream systems that I've heard of.
Yeah, I actually have a rough idea of how many wood addition projects. It's something, I mean, there aren't too many going on right now. We've been going through what's called a proof of concept phase, just demonstrating that it works. Like that study I presented from Judd Kratzer was kind of demonstrating that it's beneficial and it works. And now that we've gotten to that point, we can go more to implementation. And and so I'd say there's about 5 streams maybe across the state where it's been implemented. And right now it's us, so Fish and Wildlife Department, TNC has done some, and then there's a consultant that's doing some. So it's not something that's going on very frequently. And it's something that we are sensitive to because it is something that should be happening naturally. So you mentioned tree plantings aimed at wood, the idea of recruiting wood, and that's absolutely a long-term goal, but we're talking like 40, 50 years goal, for these trees to get big enough and that they would actually stay in place once they fall into a stream or river. And so when we're just seeing that, like on the Forest Service, we're just seeing the trees get to be big enough where they're staying once they fall into a stream and river. And so we're trying to be careful about how it gets rolled out, and because those trees they're important where they are, on the buffer, on the bank, they're providing a lot of benefits. And so we want to make sure that any wood addition isn't compromising those natural benefits. and also recognizing that this is a process that naturally occurs, as channels migrate, move side to side, wood falls in, or there's storms that come, beavers obviously can recruit wood. So there's a variety of natural processes where wood can be added to streams. So, we want to be very selective, I think, in terms of where wood addition occurs. I mean, and then from a fisheries perspective, there's also like, is it limiting the fish community? Is it important? Is the fish community there? Not to say that this only occurs for fisheries benefits. There's also water quality benefits. It raises the channel. You get more like natural channel functions and stuff like that. So, but from a fisheries perspective, there's a lot that goes into selecting a site.
Very cool. Thanks, Will. So I think we have time for a few more questions. So we're gonna keep going here, if that's all right with you. Lauren, I saw that you were asking to speak your question out loud. So I'm gonna go ahead and allow you to talk, and you should be good now.
Thanks so much, Nate, and thanks, Will. I was trying to type my question and decided that I could speak it better. So, Will, my question is, in communities where, or on individual properties where the practice might be to mow up to the edge or where there isn't much of a buffer, what is the lowest hanging fruit, in terms of action steps that someone can take, or how would you convince someone who is taking that approach to consider something else? And I can think of examples in the Upper Lamoille, for example, where culturally, super important species to folks, but there may be some disconnect sometimes.
Yeah, I wish I had the best answer for that. I don't know exactly what works. I mean, what my feeling is that when you're trying to change landowner behavior, it's what the science suggests is that the messenger is really important. And maybe somebody from the state isn't the best messenger necessarily, and so probably the most valuable, maybe the most effective person is going to be somebody in that person's community, somebody that they trust or respect at least, and to that end, we're actually working with the Lake Champlain Basin program. I don't know if anybody here is from the Lake Champlain Basin program, to create what's called the Streamwise program. And that's similar to the Lakewise program, for those of you familiar with it. And the idea is you're kind of creating this community around streams and rivers, and the landowners along streams and rivers, and kind of finding sort of somebody who can be an advocate for that watershed, and sort of empowering them to reach out to their neighbors, or to message their neighbors about the value of riparian areas. I know that's maybe not the most satisfying answer, but that's kind of the direction we're going. I mean, other than that, there's a lot of demonstration. We're doing demonstration sites on our plantings on state lands, up in Greensboro, Upper Lamoille, for example. So anyway, I'd be happy to talk to you more about it if you want to send me an email.
Great, thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Will. So let's do one more question. And then for folks that are still on, please stick around. We have a feedback poll and some more follow-up information, and we'll share Will's contact information because we're not going to be able to get to all the questions, but if you have a follow-up, you can reach out to Will or to us. But there's a couple of questions that I'm seeing on top here about the life cycle. Could you just briefly go through kind of the brook trout life cycle, and how far they might move around, like an individual's range, when they can start breeding, kind of their overall lifespan, that sort of thing?
Yeah, gosh, Yeah, no, that's awesome. Yeah, so it's very diverse, but focusing on streams and rivers, their range is, it can be small, it can be, meters, to kilometers. Sorry, I'm thinking like a scientist here. Yards, whatever, pretty small, like a pool or something like that, to farther than you would think a fish would move. So a couple like miles, and we've done some studies looking to show that, the idea. So yeah, their range can be pretty far, can be pretty big, and then in terms of life cycle, yeah, so their eggs are pretty big. So if you ever go for salmon sushi, like that's roughly the size of a brook trout egg. So it's among the fish species, it's one of the bigger eggs. They lay their eggs in the fall in gravel. Those eggs, sorry, once they're fertilized, they're called an embryo. That's just something that was hammered into me. Anyway, so the embryos incubate in the gravel over the winter. They hatch in the spring, and then that first year they're just growing. But in that second year, they can actually reach maturity. And so you could see fish in that second year spawning. And then longest that they'll live in a stream or river is maybe 2 to 3 years. Some of those individuals aren't very old, but in lakes they can grow much older.
Great. I appreciate all of the answers and the presentation, Will, for going through all of that. And like I said, we're not going to have time, just for the sake of time. We're not going to get to every question today. So I'm going to launch a feedback poll in just a second. And if you all could take a second to fill that out, that would be great. You should see that popping up on your screen right now. If for whatever reason that's not there, you can drop any feedback you have in the chat or your kudos for Will in there. And I'm gonna just go through a couple quick things. So please join us for our next Zoom a Scientist session. It's gonna be April 21st at 3:30. And Caroline will be putting a link to register for that session into the chat right now, as well as a link to our virtual learning page where we will post the recording of today's session, and you can view all of our previous sessions. I know there's a number of teachers on the line today, so please reach out to us about how we can collaborate and how Watershed Alliance can help with all of your K-12 watershed science needs. And yeah, we always like to hear from teachers and find fun ways to work together. So please reach out and check out all of our program offerings we have on there. Caroline will also put a link to our YouTube channel where you can pretty easily find all of our Zoom a Scientist presentations. Yeah, and so with that, I just want to thank everyone again. We're going to drop Will's email in the chat as well. So please copy that down and reach out to Will. But yeah, that's all I have. So Will, thanks again. Really appreciate it. It was a pleasure to have you on. And thanks to all of our attendees for joining us today.
Yeah,
Thanks,
thank you.
Yep, bye-bye.
Well.
Bye.